I'm Gregory Lott. I'm the chair of the Southeast Chapter here at the Massachusetts Archaeological Society. And I want to welcome everybody here. I'm glad to see a lot of faces that we know and a couple of new surprises. I would like to start out tonight. I'd like to welcome Dr. David Weed, a retired clinical psychologist with an avid interest in 17th century history and King Philip's War. And he's going to present tonight on the Sowams heritage area. So I'd like to turn it over to David. And if you see me running, I'll be letting more people in the door that's locked. So.
Thank you, Greg. Nice to be back here. I don't get here as often as I should, but hopefully with some of these new presentations coming up in the spring, I'll have a chance to come back and join you again. As Greg said, I'm a retired clinical psychologist, so what the heck am I doing here talking about history? Well, this is what happens when you retire, right? And you've got time on your hands, and then you find out that there are things you don't know a whole lot about, you want to find out more. So I'll explain in just a moment how I got involved in all of that. This is about Sowams. Has anybody in this room ever heard that name before? A couple people, 2 or 3. And that's typical because nobody tells you about Sowams. Sowams is the home of the Massasoit Usamiquan, who met the Pilgrims in 1621, signed a treaty with them, not 401 years ago, in March 22nd of 1621. That treaty guaranteed the survival of both the English and the tribe which was not Wampanoag, Pocanooka. Okay, look back in your history books and we'll talk some more about that. So it turned out I live right where Usamiquan is buried. I look out my back window and there he is in Burrs Hill Park. That's where his grave is. He was reburied there 4 years ago, and that's what got me started on all of this. Anybody ever been to any of these communities?
We live in Bristol.
All right! Yeah, so you could talk to these folks about what it's like in that part of the world. Just so you know, I worked as a clinical psychologist in Fall River for 33 years, so I'm familiar with this part of Massachusetts as well. But since I retired, I've had to get to know Rhode Island that I never knew. I lived there, but I didn't know what was going on there. Now I do. If you drive through downtown Warren and look up at the town hall, at the top you'll see this frieze over the doorway, which hardly anybody ever looks at. And if you look more closely, it says Sowams 1621. For 40 years I lived there and I had no idea what that was. Well, that was an indication that the town really claims to be the village, the settlement where Usamiquan spent most of his life. And we have a good deal of evidence for that. Most people, when they go to Plymouth, they see the Dallin statue there, and they think, oh, Usamiquan must have lived here in Plymouth, right? Makes sense. Well, no, he had to walk 42 miles to get there, along with his warriors. And it was a good thing that he didn't live there, because what happened 3 years before the Pilgrims arrived in 1620? A plague. We've been through it, but not to the extent that they suffered. Over 90% of the people who were living along the coast died from one or more infectious diseases. So that changed the circumstances under which Usamiquan had to deal with the English at that point. Here's his burial site behind my house in Warren. This is in Burrs Hill Park. If you're You drive down Water Street, the beach is on one side and the park is on the other. And this is the excavation of the site to return over 600 items that were taken out of the park in 1913 by Charles Carr. He was a town librarian, but he fancied himself to be an amateur archaeologist. And because people were digging up all kinds of things in that park as it was used as a sand and gravel pit by the railroad that went through, there's a bike path right at the back of the park there, he decided that the better thing to do was to remove those items before they were all stolen and taken away. So he got permission from the railroad and dug up the 42 grave sites, but then sent much of it to either the Hay Museum in New York, Pfaffenreffer in Bristol and for Brown, and some of it in a small museum that he kept on the second floor of the library in Warren. So here we find nothing left that we know of in that area since 1913 until a coalition including the Mashpee Wampanoags decided under the Native American Gravesite Reclamation Act from 1980 that they could go reclaim those things. They spent 20 years and did an excellent job of getting all of that back. And then in the ceremony in 2017, reburied all over 600 of those items in a vault underneath the soil in the park, right where Carr had dug them up in 1913. So they've been returned. They should remain there forever. And now there's a very nice monument over that gravesite. That's what got me started, because I was invited to that ceremony, began to ask a whole lot of questions, and learned a whole lot about why this was there. Sowams is part of the territory that the Massasoit had dominion over. Not that he ruled like a king, because they ruled by consensus, but he was designated as the leader to represent over 60 tribes, sub-tribes, and when the English came to negotiations, they knew they had to negotiate with Osamequin. And he was successful in hammering out an agreement that took us forward. He had been there, his tribe, his people, since the glaciers retreated. You all know about that. If you come to the Robbins Museum, I don't have to tell you about this. And it wasn't until Europeans began showing up, probably as early as 1000 with the Vikings, and then certainly all throughout the 16th century, all kinds of fishing, trading, one thing or another. But the difference was in 1620, people came with women and children with an intent to stay. That was new. So the people who had been here and lived very successfully, as far as we know, I have found no evidence that people suffered starvation in large numbers, or disease, or any other evidence, and maybe some of you can inform me about that, but as far as I know, this was a very successful civilization. They had some intertribal wars, but they didn't fight wars like they fought in Europe at the time. The idea wasn't to kill your enemy. The idea was to either enslave or bring your enemy into your tribe. So people really respected life in that manner. So there was trading going on in the area, and then, as I mentioned earlier, disease hit. That's the first time we know of this kind of dying. I have seen no evidence that this kind of infectious disease took place prior to 1616. But it left the tribe greatly weakened, and you had the pilgrims, half of whom had died over that same period. So you had two desperate groups who really needed one another. when Osamequin met with Governor Carver, they formed an alliance, and this is the 6-point treaty. It's called the Wampanoag Treaty. It really should be called Pocanooka. The name Wampanoag, by the way, never appeared until Cotton Mather used it during the King Philip War. It doesn't exist any time prior to that, and the Massasoit never heard the word Wampanoag. We can talk more about that later. But the treaty was really a mutual protection agreement. We'll protect you, you protect us, and we'll adjudicate any problems within our own people in that regard. And it lasted for over 50 years, about 10 years after Osamequin's death, when things began to go south in the 1670s and leading up to the King Philip War. This is one of the most significant treaties and should be celebrated in America. We should know this the same way you know about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. But nobody's ever heard of it. The only time the federal government has ever recognized this is in a coin on the back side of the Sacagawea dollar coin. There's the Wampanoag Treaty. That's it. You don't see it anywhere else. That's one of the reasons that we want to start a national heritage area to tell this story and to educate people about what happened there, because this was a pivotal moment in time that had things not gone the way they did, everything would have been different, particularly in New England. You all know about Ed Winslow. He was, I like to think of him as the, basically the negotiator for the Pilgrims. He spent a lot of time with Osamequin and got to know him quite well. We know of 2 visits that are well recorded and published at the time, 1622 and 1624, and they describe those visits in great detail. The second visit occurred in 1623 when Winslow came and, according to the way he describes it, helped to cure Osamequin of we don't know exactly what. One interesting theory is that Osamequin was suffering from botulism, possibly from food that he got on board a Dutch trading ship that had just left the area. We don't know. I don't think there's any way of finding out, but you can speculate that the man was deathly ill. He was blind, he couldn't swallow, he was in terrible shape. Winslow comes and gives him a little bit of English jelly, sends for a chicken to make chicken soup, never got there in time. But Osamequin recovers and says, "Keen Winslow, we shall be friends for life." And he meant it. And they kept that friendship up for the rest of their lives. Winslow, of course, dies in the 1640s, but the treaty and the understanding and the friendship between the English and the Pocanooka Tribe continued on. If you're in Warren, you can stop and see the Massasoit Spring there. It's not a running spring any longer, but it's some evidence of the settlement that was there at the time. And there's a huge argument that goes on back around the turn of the century between Virginia Baker, who said that the settlement must have been in Warren, and then Tom Bicknell from Barrington, who said, no, it was across the river, it was in Barrington. And it doesn't really matter. They probably moved around a good deal anyway, but it makes for interesting reading. Here's an illustration of Winslow's cure, which is worth a read. If you go, it's online. You can find good news from New England, and just wonderful description of what happened then. And this is also celebrated in a movie. It's been acted, and if you go on the Sowams Heritage Area website and look at videos, go down the page a little bit, and you'll have a link to the portion of the video that acts out this particular event. So I often wondered, what did Sowams look like? And not knowing anything, I'm thinking, oh, it must have been full of a forest with giant oak trees and, you know, just pristine, never been touched, never been cut. Wrong. For at least 800 years, we have evidence that the Pocanooka people were raising corn, like many people along the shore in the east. And if you want to clear a field, what do? You don't have axes other than stone axes. Fire. It's actually relatively simple to burn forests twice a year and keep the area open. It's good for the land and it keeps the area open. So I just took a Google map and erased some of the trees in the area that were there, and it helps me imagine what the area must have looked like. And we have a pretty good description by Miles Standish, who came there and said this is the garden of the patent being, you know, what the king gave the land to the English, and the flower, Flour, of the garden. The spelling wasn't so good. So they knew that this was prime land for agriculture, for raising animals, etc. And they wanted a piece of it, and that's what happened. Miles and company, while they were protecting the area, in many ways they kept an eye on where they could get some rich open farmland, which was essentially unavailable in England. At the time, there was very little land available, especially if you weren't a nobility, and you could either spend your time as a serf and a servant on someone else's land and paying exorbitant rent, or you could come to America and you could buy acres and acres of land, cleared and ready to work. Speaking of people who came here, this is also the area where our good friend Roger Williams came. The story is that he first arrived in Plymouth when he came over in 1631. That was the place that he first started to. He wasn't a preacher exactly, he was more of a religious educator at the time. But he brought his particular radical ideas, and it wasn't long before they said, no, we don't want to hear what you have to say. Why don't you go somewhere else? So during that time, however, he got to know Usamequin, and if you know anything about Roger, he was a master at learning languages. His father was a cloth merchant in London, and Roger would go down to the docks to purchase cloth from the ships that would come in from India and around the world. And he learned that if he could speak the language of the crew and talk with them while the ship had come in, before anybody started negotiating prices, he would already work a deal with them. He was very good at that kind of exchange. So when he gets to Plymouth, he says, I need to learn to speak Algonquin and learn the language, which you can read in his book, The Key to the Languages of America, which he wrote on a ship over a 2-month journey back to England to get a charter in 1642. And from memory, he writes all these Algonquin phrases and their English equivalents in that book. It's fabulous. So up to Salem he goes, looking for another job, preaches there for a brief period of time, less than a year, and he starts getting in trouble again because he's saying things like the church and the state shouldn't be the same thing and all of that. The governor in Boston from Mass Bay says, we don't want you here. And they go to send a party up to Salem to put him on a ship and send him back to England. In January, of 1636, one of the coldest Januaries around, the Narragansett Bay was mostly frozen over at that time. I haven't seen that in my lifetime. It was cold, 3 feet of snow. What does Roger decide to do? He leaves Salem. Where does he go? Back down to Plymouth, his old friend, Usamequin. Well, Usamequin doesn't live in Plymouth. So he comes over to Sowams, where Usamequin lives in the winter. And fortunately, he was rescued, probably by some of Usamequin's warriors, and brought to a place called Margaret's Rock, or Margaret's Cave. This rock exists just over the Warren line in Swansea. You won't be able to go to it, it's on private property, but we lead walks to it a few times a year. Let me know if you're interested in going. We were doing one on June 4th, I think. But this, according to legend, we don't have archaeological evidence. Anybody want to look for some? This was the it's not really a cave, as you can see. It's the end of a rock outcropping, but with logs piled up against here, you could light a fire in there and be sheltered. Well, we began to think, would Usamequin send his friend Roger out in the middle of the woods in January to recover from his pneumonia and whatever else he was suffering from? Doesn't make sense, does it? Well, what we figured out was that was the winter settlement of Usamequin. He wasn't out there by himself, he was out there with the tribe. And we've since had a artist do a rendering of what that settlement might have looked like. We know they moved inland in the winter. You can fault us on our lack of historical credibility, but we're simply saying all of this stuff makes sense. You don't leave a guy out in the woods for 14 weeks and expect him to recover. You put him out there where you're already living and where there's plenty of food and other shelter. So Margaret's Rock is part of the Sowams Heritage Area and something we hope someday to have open to the public, or at least have guided tours there. Roger recovers long enough for Usamequin to say, here's a good place to go settle, and sends him up to Omega Pond in what's today East Providence, is Rehoboth at the time. And he begins a small settlement there. It's along the Blackstone River, or the Seekonk River, depending on how far up you are. So there's a monument there, that's Omega Pond, and there's some 17th century houses nearby. But our good friend Ed Winslow shows up one day in June, after he'd been there from April. And he's got his crops planted and the corn's starting to come up and everything seems fine. And Ed Winslow says, you're on Plymouth land, you have to leave. So the apocryphal story, if you're from Providence, everybody knows the story of how Roger Williams is sent across the Seekonk River in a boat, meets with Canonicus, the Narragansett tribal leader, and is greeted with what cheer Netop, which simply means hello friend. If you look at the Department of Public Works trucks in the city of Providence, it all says what cheer on them. So that's the apocryphal story of how Roger is taken over to the east side of today's Providence and sets up a small settlement there. There's an artist rendering of what it might have looked like at the time. This would be North Main Street. This would be Smith Hill, where the state capitol building is, Newtoconica Hill in the back, downtown Providence over here. There's good evidence that Roger got along well, and his whole attitude toward Native people was mostly to be admired, even though he ends up in, recommending the enslavement of people after the King Philip War. But he had, let's put it this way, at least as good a relationship with the Narragansetts as the English had with the Poconookets. And today, there are no existing buildings from the 17th century in Providence. I was shocked. The last one was the Pidge Tavern up on North Main Street that was demolished about 20 years ago. the only evidence you can find is at the bottom of College Street. There is a single bridge that essentially is the 8th version of the bridge, the original bridge that used to cross the river. It's the only way you could get from the West Bay to the East Bay and stay dry was going across that one piece of land. And Roger was the toll taker there. That was how he made a living. Not long after Roger's settlement in 1642, a whole group from Weymouth with Reverend Samuel Newman came down and settled in, if you're familiar with East Providence, the Rumford section. The church obviously was not from 1643, but it gathered in 1643. There's a cemetery across the street from it that has burials of the original people. William Carpenter was his grave is the oldest one there from 1653, and this is the beginning of what was called the Ring of the Green. A very interesting piece of real estate here. I didn't quite understand it until I took a drawing that someone had done of the plots here and superimposed it over a Google map of East Providence. And lo and behold, it fit perfectly. What you have is the 10 Mile River coming down here and looping around here and going over to the Seekonk River along here. So you start by creating a green in the middle for all of your animals. You put them in at night, you pay somebody to stay up all night and keep the wolves away, and you have a gate that leads right to that from the front of your property. At the back of your property, you have access to water, either fresh water or salt water here. And then a wood lot behind that, and plenty of room to do your gardening. What a deal. I wish I was a real estate agent then. So that whole settlement survived up until the King Philip War, when like just about every colonial structure was burned to the ground. There's the William Carpenter grave marker on the right. Close to the Ring of the Green area is Hunt's Mills. 1640s, there were mills along the 10 Mile River. The river still flows there. It's a fabulous place, and I wish more people would see it. That's why we want to have a heritage area, so people will discover these things. The herrings still run there. There's a fish ladder now, and we hope to develop some of the buildings that are there and do more interpretive work. But certainly the Pocanooka people knew this river well, and there's terrific hiking along there too. If you go up to Rehoboth, what is today Rehoboth, you know Rehoboth was first an 8 by 8 mile town laid out, and for every colonist who was farming there, who had children, and many of the families were large, there were more and more and more demands on the land. And because the Poconookets had few resources, trading had pretty much stopped at that point for furs. The sale of land was about the only thing they could do to raise any money and survive. It was very difficult for them to farm because the English cattle and pigs were encroaching on their farmland. It was not a good arrangement there, and it was heading for disaster, and that's what happened in 1675 with these English towns surrounding it all the way down into Newport, and the Pocanooka people pretty much confined to Consumset or the Bristol Peninsula. It wasn't Philip who decided to go to war, though there's some evidence that he made some preparations. It was a group of local natives in the town I live in, Warren, at Joe Winslow's farm, who started rifling a farm and shot a cow, and then the son of Jeb Winslow shoots one of the native men, and the deal was if you draw the first blood, you're going to lose the war. So they thought the English were going to lose the war, and there was a blood red moon and all kinds of portends on that. The war breaks out and develops quite quickly, and I'm not going to go through the detail of the King Philip War, that's for another time. But it was a war that changed everything in the balance of power. At first it looked like the Poconookets were going to be successful along with their alliance with the Nipmunks and then eventually with the Narragansetts, that they would be successful in driving the English back to England. That was the point. It was, we're going to lose our culture, everything, if we don't get these people to leave. And some people did leave. But the war went into the wintertime. The Poconookets were running out of food. There was the great swamp fight that brought the Narragansetts in. And then in the spring, they began losing more and more of their people as Benjamin Church, who was leading the effort, decided to no longer use the standard method of English warfare, line up and shoot on command. They began using guerrilla tactics that the Poconookets had been successfully using. And they had native people who were allied now with the English. So by August of 1675, the war had pretty much ended with Philip's death at Mount Hope. You can go and visit the location where that occurred. And the enslavement of many of the tribal people who had occupied that land for 10,000 years, and now they're driven out, enslaved, now outright killed, sent to Barbados. And that's why when you come to New England, you go, where are the native people? You go out west, you see lots of native people. Where are they now? Okay. Well, there was a 300-year effort to basically erase native presence in New England. And it was almost successful, and it's only been, really, if you think about it, only in the last 50 years that there's been a real effort, particularly on the part of the Wampanoags over in Plymouth, but also the Narragansetts and the Poconookets and the Nipmunks, to begin to tell their story and to make themselves known. It was illegal to be Pocanooka after the war. If you were 14 years of age or older, you could be shot on sight. You couldn't speak the language. I mean, this was genocide by any definition, and it almost worked. Today, you can visit the Garrison House where the war broke out in Swansea. This is Philip's death site. There are a few locations we've identified, and if you look on the brochure, that if you pick one of those up in the back of the room, there are over 50 locations, all from the 17th century that we've been able to find there. And what we're trying to do is to weave that story together so people understand what happened and can go see some of the places, including Anawan Rock in Rehoboth. That was where the final battle was fought, but it wasn't a battle. Chief Anawan met with Church after they were discovered in the woods and stayed up all night, according to the story, telling war stories. And Church didn't want to have him killed, but they sent him to Plymouth, and next thing you know, he's no longer alive. Today there are cemeteries all over the place, from many of which have 17th century burials. Farms that go back to the King's Grant at that time. I love the one at the bottom, which is the Chase Farm in North Warren, 1693, King's Grant Farm, been in two families since that period of time. And fortunately, a few places around where you can still get some idea of what life might have been like 400 years ago. We need to preserve those. I've been able to discover some important places. Of course, there are rock outcroppings like the Abrams Rock behind Swansea Town Hall. Of course, Mount Hope and the seat of the Massasoit. Newtoconnicut Hill. Anybody been there? I'd never heard of it. It's in the western boundary of Providence, 300-foot hill up there. Okay, you could walk, it's all park, you can walk up there and get a great view of the city. But at that spot on the right, the four tribes, the Massachusetts, the Nipmuc, the Narragansett, and the Pocanooka, would meet for council up there. And typical, as you know, of how do you find native presence? Do you look for buildings? No. Do you look for markers? No. You look for rocks. And if you can learn to read the rocks, you will find things all over the place, okay? They were masters of building structures and effigies, animals, ceremonial stones, calendar rocks, you name it. And there's a whole study of that kind of thing going on. I like to say that the Mount Hope in Bristol, which is a huge granite outcropping there, is like the Acropolis in Athens. It's a significant place for people for thousands of years, and yet people have no awareness of what's going on there. I'm still trying to find out what this is. This is a stone right on Route 136, and I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but to me that looks like a calendar rock to me. It's, first of all, it's a glacial erratic, no question about that.
Yeah.
But glaciers don't usually prop things up with stones under the bottom there, nor do they necessarily locate those erratics on the top of a granite outcropping on a knoll that's been described forever as Sachem's Knoll across the street from King's Rock, which is where the native women ground corn in a groove across the top. There's just too much going on there to think that, that's just happenstance that rock is there. But I'd love to get verification at some point, and probably never will. But again, this is about reading rocks. This is a little bit of Bristol. I'll quickly go through these and we'll wrap up, and so we can have some time to talk. Bristol was laid out in 1680 after the close of the King Philip War, because it wasn't ever purchased by English colonists. It was simply taken, okay? Even though there were tribe members around, that it could have been negotiated. Never was. And the tribe hasn't forgotten that, okay? There's all kinds of archaeological evidence around, and in this room I would not dare to provide any expert knowledge, but what I found online, you can find on the website. There are many locations. I think the oldest one is about 8,000 years. Doesn't mean that we have found everything. A lot of it's likely already buried and will never be found, at least until the buildings above them are raised. But there's certainly plenty of evidence of Paleo-Indian sites around, and this room is full of them. So I don't need to explain all of this to this group, but I like to remind people when they go and visit there that there is evidence of civilization. And I say that, in all respect, because this was, again, even though, we don't have ancient buildings there, this was a successful population of people who survived well for thousands of years, had their own culture, their own language, and their own religious beliefs. What more do you need to call it a civilization? And more sites here that you can discover in the area, and maybe some of you know of things that I don't know about, and I'd love to hear about that. This is one collection of native tools that were taken out of the Kickamuit River, and that's part of Charles Carr's collection. It's now being returned to the Poconookets. They're not burial items, but I've convinced the librarian that these do not belong in a settler colonial museum. If the Pocanooka people want to display them, that's up to them, but those belong to them. And here we are back at where we started, at the Burrs Hill Park Monument, and there's a picture of the celebration of the burial site and the vault where everything came from and has gone back. We have pretty good evidence that Osamequin is buried there, because Ed Winslow describes how he gave him a red horseman's coat and with a lace cuff and a copper bead chain. Well, in one of the graves they found the lace and the copper bead chain. In fact, the Heaven River Museum has the copper bead chain. The chain was given to him, by the way, in order to communicate back and forth, because what Osamequin could do, if he wanted to get a message to the English in Plymouth, he would send a runner with the chain, and they would know in Plymouth that that came from Osamequin and not one of his imposters, okay? So it was a useful tool, but that's in possession of the museum. Unless, I don't know, they may have returned it. It may be reburied there. I simply don't know, because the tribe's not going to tell me what's in the vault. Here's the tribe today, the Pocanooka Tribe, alive and well, not federally recognized. In fact, they're not even interested in federal recognition because they consider themselves a sovereign nation. Why do they have to go under the U.S. government? Okay, you tell me. And the tribe often does presentations in our area, and I work very closely with them. And we're working hard with them to get Mount Hope back from the Heaven River Museum. Okay, you're laughing, but you know that that's been an ongoing effort for actually about 20 years. We're getting close. We've had some land surveys by PAL has been up there, and I can't say for certain, but it looks like things are moving in the direction. Brown's going to be leaving that property anyway. They're moving everything downtown right now, and there's no reason for them to be there. And to give the tribe back one piece of their sacred land is a goal that we've had for the last 4 years that I've been working on this project. You can come and explore anytime. This is all on the Sowams Heritage Area website. These are the 50-some locations around the area, and you can come and learn the story and see it all right there. Make it a nice afternoon drive to come down, okay? It's not that far, 45 minutes and you're there, okay? That's all I have to say at the moment. I think we still have a little bit of time for some questions. So did I explain everything so thoroughly that, yeah.
Okay, you had a picture of a balanced rock.
Yes.
Stones, where is that?
That's on Route 136, Market Street, just as you're going north out of Warren, crossing into Swansea. If you know Johnson's Market there, it's right across the street from that.
Okay.
The best time to see it is now before the leaves come out, because there's a fence there and there's a lot of brush that's grown up there. It's on private land, but I've been working with the owner there, and we've had a chance to go up there and really take a close look at it. A friend of mine who's into native stone structures has looked at it very thoroughly and even done, there's a meter that you can use that tells you some kind of
OSL?
Yeah, he says it went crazy when he brought it up there.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not magnetic, but something along those lines. Don't ask me. But yep.
Can you talk a little bit about Pocanooka versus Wampanoag and that identity?
Sure.
And
Yeah.
been curious about that.
I have a 17-minute video on the website, so I won't go into all the detail on that. But basically, first of all, if you read some of the well-established authors like Neil Salisbury or Jeremy Bangs, these are people who really know their stuff. They do not use Wampanoag. They talk about the Pocanooka Tribe. And like I say, it was never, the word Wampanoag didn't appear until Cotton Mather used it in 1675 during the King Philip War to refer to the alliance of tribes that Philip had put together, because he didn't want to just say, you know, the names of 5 tribes. So it's the Wampanoag Confederation, if you will. It was Wampus means Easterner. Okay, so Wampanoag means Easterner. And the folks in Mashpee will tell you that. I mean, that, you know, the people of the dawn of the East. But Pocanooka was clearly the name of the both. Remember, it's not just the tribes didn't have names back then. You know, they didn't come up to you and say, "Oh, I'm a Wampanoag." No, you and the land are all the same. Okay, your name comes from where you live. So if you live in Pocanooka, you are Pocanooka. Okay. The name Wampanoag began to be used first in literature. It was really part of the effort to erase Pocanooka from, this is part of that great erasure process. Don't allow them to use that, take the name away. But even people like William Epps, who, you know, did a very inspirational speech, he uses Pocanooka, not Wampanoag. So you will see more and more of the use of the name Wampanoag as you get to the modern day. And the Wampanoag Federation was 1928. It was that recent. And I'm not going to go into it because my Wampanoag friends would not appreciate my saying things because they have their own take on stuff, and that's fine. But Poconookets understand things differently, even though, as they say, we were all one people. It's only been in the 20th century that there's been these efforts to divide and, you know, make tribes different. They weren't. Yep.
I wonder if you could tell me a little more about the status of the Hafenrather Museum and the artifacts in it. I visited it
Sure.
probably 10 years ago, and got a lot of good history about the tribes there. But I don't know if that's closed, if the
Yes,
artifacts
it's been closed for 7 years.
And are the artifacts
Everything's being moved to downtown Providence. The Brown University Hafenrather got a $5 million Mellon grant, and the grant said you have 4 years to remove everything. And they hired people to photograph and move it. They should move it. That facility is, if you're an archivist, that's one of the worst places you can imagine to keep things. It's an old barn, you know. So they're in a state-of-the-art facility. Unfortunately, mostly in storage. It's really unfortunate that Brown pays very little attention to local Native history. You can find things from all over the world there, but you want something in the town where it happened? No, they don't.
Just a follow-up, so those artifacts aren't going to be going back to the tribes?
Well, the only requirement is burial items. Okay, if it came out of a grave, by law, it has to go back. So anything else is fair game. And I don't know of their intention to return it to the tribe. And then there's all kinds of contentious things. Which tribe does it go back to, and who really owns it, one thing or another.
But they're in the process of trying to return the land to the people?
We hope. That's what the tribe would like, and you know, there's efforts going on to make that happen. But we'll have to see. I mean, the land is unoccupied, and it's zoned in such a way that no one can build on it anyway. I don't know, I have no idea what the university plans to do with the land. They don't have any use for it. And here is a sacred site. Let's do the right thing and return the land to the people who originally occupied it.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Sure.
Is there anything you're trying to discover now? I mean, you've uncovered a lot in the area. Is there any missing puzzle piece you're trying to solve for, or something that in your research you can't find in the area?
Yeah, I'd still like to find out about that perched rock. I've asked everybody.
Now, with the perched rocks, in my opinion, and I think a lot of geologists would agree, that can be a natural process.
Right.
Because if you take a glacial erratic and it lands on sediment like sand, it'll kind of sink into the sand. If it happens to land on bedrock, it sits on the bedrock. Now, why are there little rocks under it? Well, because there are other sediments. So that bedrock, if it's covered in sediment and gravel, and the big glacial erratic is sitting on top of it, the other sediments erode away, and that's when you get them in this space underneath it. But I mean, I've seen that underwater where you have rocks the size of a small bus, and you can see underneath the whole rock. And at a certain point, if a rock weighs 40 tons or something, there's really no theory that people did that. And it's not saying that some rocks aren't moved, or some things aren't modified. You got to take it by case basis. But I would not assume that it can't be natural. That there are natural processes.
It could be, and you're right. And if it were natural, it more than likely had significance.
Well, it doesn't mean
People live there.
that's not a landmark
No,
in
right.
itself. So
Yes.
even if it's a completely natural formation, it may still be a landmark, a meeting place,
You're right.
a sacred place. Nonetheless, it doesn't have to be constructed to have all those other layers
Right.
attached to it.
Yeah. Tim Ives, if you know him from,
Yes.
his theory is that a bunch of drunk college students roll the rock up there. So, come on, Tim. Yeah.
You didn't mention Dighton Rock, and I
Oh,
don't
no.
know, have you been to Dighton Rock?
Oh, yeah, I did a
Yes.
presentation like this there a couple months
I
back.
went
yeah.
to a camp on the opposite
Yep.
side of the shore called Tatapanum. It was read about Tatapanum, but I don't really know the essence of what the rock is all about. I don't.
Well, that's for a whole other presentation.
You know what?
It's indigenous.
I can let you know that on July 10th, there'll be a panel discussion being held at Dighton Rock on many of the different theories that have taken place there, and several of us on the board here at MAS are going to be involved in it.
You're gonna let us know, right?
I'm telling you right now, Penny,
Yeah,
okay?
yeah.
No, it's July 10th, I'll tell you what, we'll put it, I mean, we have a Southeast chapter on Facebook, and anybody, I mean, we're trying to get things rolling again with the emails, so we've got some paper in back, if anybody wants to add their email address to get, reports from the chapter, we'll be more than happy to add you to our list. We're trying to streamline a little bit, so, but that's July 10th, I can tell you that, at Dighton Rock.
So there's all kinds of things to keep learning about.
Absolutely, yeah. And in fact, when David was talking about some of these ceremonial landscapes and different rocks in different areas, next month, that guy who's speaking out the back right now, Derek Gunn, is actually going to be speaking on a lot of those different subjects. Derek's part of the New England Antiquities Research Association, and
Right.
be another step.
I hope
in that some of
are they
those
going to have
directions.
another conference soon? I was at the last one in Warwick.
Conferences at the end of April in
It's in Connecticut this year.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great organization.
Thank
A lot of really good stuff, yeah. So, is that it?
Thank you, David.
Okay.